The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October, 1864. Sister Mary Catherine held it in her weathered hands as the autumn rain beat against the broken windows of St. Aurelia's chapel. 30 years had passed since that terrible winter night, but the yellowed paper trembled in her fingers like it carried the weight of 2 small graves. The orphanage had been empty for 5 years now. The state had closed it after the last child found a family, but Sister Mary Catherine remained. She had nowhere else to go, and the truth was buried too deep in these walls to leave behind. At 68, her back bent from decades of scrubbing floors and her eyes dim from reading by candlelight, she was the only soul who remembered what really happened in the winter of 1834. The chapel smelled of old wood and forgotten prayers. Dust particles danced in the gray light that filtered through cracked stained glass. The wooden pews stood empty, their surfaces worn smooth by the hands of children who had prayed for families that never came. Sister Mary Catherine sat in the front row, the same place she had knelt every morning for 30 years, asking God to forgive what she had done. The letter had come from a law office in Boston. The handwriting was careful and formal, but the words cut through her heart like winter wind. She read them again, though she had memorized every line since the postman brought it to her door 3 days ago. Dear Sister Mary Catherine, we are writing to inform you that the estate of Mr. Thomas Whitmore has been settled. Before his death last spring, Mr. Whitmore left specific instructions regarding 2 children who may have been in your care at St. Aurelia Orphanage in the winter of 1834. The children were twins, Emma and Samuel Morrison, aged 8 years. Mr. Whitmore claimed to have information about their fate and wished to make provisions for their care, should they still be living. The paper rustled as her hand shook. Thomas Whitmore. She remembered that name. He had been the county inspector who came that February night, the man who wanted to separate the twins, the man whose decision had driven her to make the choice that haunted every sunrise since. Rain continued to pound the roof above her head. The sound reminded her of that night 30 years ago, when sleet had turned to snow and the world outside became a frozen wilderness. Emma and Samuel had been sleeping in the small room they shared at the end of the hall. They always slept holding hands, even in their separate beds. Their small fingers would reach across the space between them, finding each other in the darkness. Sister Mary Catherine closed her eyes and could still see their faces. Emma with her dark hair that never stayed braided, always falling in soft waves around her pale cheeks. Samuel with his serious blue eyes that seemed too old for his small face. They had arrived at St. Aurelia in November, brought by a sheriff who said their parents had died in a fire. The children hadn't spoken a word since the tragedy. They communicated only with each other, through looks and gentle touches that broke the heart of anyone who watched them. The inspector, Thomas Whitmore, had different plans for the twins. He believed children should be separated to make them stronger, to help them learn to depend on themselves instead of each other. He had papers from the state, documents that would send Emma to a textile mill in Lowell and Samuel to a farm in western Massachusetts. They would never see each other again. Sister Mary Catherine had begged him to reconsider. She explained how the children were healing slowly, how they were beginning to trust her, how separating them would destroy the last piece of family they had left. But Whitmore was a hard man who believed in hard choices. He said the state knew what was best for orphan children. He would return in the morning to collect them. That night, Sister Mary Catherine had made her choice. She still remembered the weight of it, how it felt like stepping off the edge of the world. She had taken Emma and Samuel from their beds while the other children slept. She had dressed them in their warmest clothes and given them what food she could carry. Then she had led them out into the February storm, believing that love was stronger than winter, that somehow they would find their way to safety. She had been wrong. The letter from Boston continued with details about Thomas Whitmore's estate. He had grown wealthy over the years, the lawyer wrote. He had never married, never had children of his own. In his final months, he had become obsessed with finding Emma and Samuel Morrison. He claimed to have new information about what happened to them after they disappeared from St. Aurelia. He wanted to make amends for his role in their fate. But Thomas Whitmore had died before he could reveal what he knew. The lawyer was hoping Sister Mary Catherine could provide information about the twins' whereabouts. The estate was prepared to offer a substantial reward for any knowledge of their fate. Sister Mary Catherine laughed, but the sound was hollow in the empty chapel. A reward. After 30 years of carrying this weight, they offered her money for the truth. But truth was something that couldn't be bought or sold. Truth was something that lived in the ground behind the orphanage, under the old oak tree, where she had buried her guilt along with 2 small bodies she had found when the snow finally melted that spring. The rain was getting heavier now, drumming against the windows like fingers tapping in endless rhythm. Sister Mary Catherine folded the letter carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. She had been alone with this secret for 3 decades. The other nuns had been sent to different parishes when the orphanage closed. The children who had lived here were grown now, scattered across the country with families and lives of their own. No one remained who remembered Emma and Samuel Morrison. No one except her. She stood slowly, her joints protesting after sitting too long on the hard wooden pew. The chapel felt smaller now, as if the weight of memory was pressing down on the walls. Candles flickered on the altar, casting dancing shadows across the crucifix that hung above it. Sister Mary Catherine had lit those candles every morning for 30 years, praying for the souls of 2 children who had trusted her to keep them safe. Tomorrow was Wednesday. In 3 days, the lawyer expected an answer to his letter. He wanted to know what had become of Emma and Samuel Morrison. He wanted the truth about that February night in 1834. Sister Mary Catherine walked slowly toward the altar, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She knew what she had to do. The choice was the same one she had faced 30 years ago, only now she understood the weight of consequences in a way her younger self never could. Outside, the storm was growing stronger, and somewhere in the sound of rain against glass, she could almost hear the whisper of small voices calling her name. The candles burned low in the chapel as Sister Mary Catherine allowed herself to remember. November 1834 had been the coldest anyone could recall. The first snow fell early that year, covering the hills around St. Aurelia orphanage like a white blanket that would not lift until spring. She was 34 then, young enough to believe that love could heal any wound, that kindness was stronger than the cruelest circumstances. Sheriff Benjamin Cole had brought the twins to her door on a Thursday evening. His horse stamped and snorted in the cold air, steam rising from its nostrils like ghostly breath. The sheriff himself looked tired, his face drawn with the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much pain in the world. He carried Emma in his arms while Samuel walked beside him, his small hand gripping the sheriff's coat. "These are the Morrison children," Sheriff Cole had said, his voice quiet in the way men spoke when tragedy was too heavy for loud words. "House fire took their parents 3 days ago. Children haven't spoken since." Sister Mary Catherine had opened the door wider, welcoming them into the warmth of the orphanage. Emma's dark hair was matted and dirty, her dress torn and stained with smoke. Samuel's blue eyes stared at nothing, his face pale as winter morning. They were identical in their silence, identical in their grief. The other children at St. Aurelia had tried to befriend the twins. There were 12 orphans in total that winter, ages ranging from 5 to 15. They shared meals at the long wooden table in the dining hall, played together in the common room when their chores were finished, and attended lessons in the small classroom where Sister Mary Catherine taught them reading and writing. But Emma and Samuel remained apart from the others, locked in their own world of shared sorrow. They communicated without words. A look between them could say more than hours of conversation. Emma would touch Samuel's shoulder when she sensed his fear. Samuel would take Emma's hand when nightmares woke her in the dark hours before dawn. They ate from each other's plates, shared the same cup of milk, and slept with their beds pushed together so their fingers could intertwine across the narrow space. Sister Mary Catherine had watched them with growing concern and growing love. She had cared for many orphan children over the years, but there was something different about the Morrison twins. Their bond was deeper than sibling affection. They seemed to share the same heart, the same wounded soul split between two small bodies. As weeks passed, she began to see small signs of healing. Emma would sometimes hum while she helped with laundry, though she still never spoke. Samuel would look up when Sister Mary Catherine read stories to the children, his eyes showing the first spark of interest she had seen since his arrival. They began to eat more, to sleep more peacefully, to trust that they were safe within the walls of St. Aurelia. Christmas came and went quietly. The children made simple decorations from pine branches and berries, sang carols around the fireplace, and shared small gifts that Sister Mary Catherine had sewn during the long evenings. Emma and Samuel participated in their silent way, holding hands during prayers, sitting close together during the Christmas story. For the first time since their parents' death, they seemed almost like children again instead of tiny ghosts haunted by smoke and flame. Then February arrived, bringing with it the worst blizzard in 20 years and Thomas Whitmore, the county inspector who would change everything. Whitmore was a thin man with sharp features and sharper opinions about how orphan children should be raised. He believed that dependency made children weak, that they needed to learn self-reliance above all else. He had visited St. Aurelia twice before, always finding fault with Sister Mary Catherine's methods. Her children were too comfortable, he said, too attached to each other and to her. They needed to be hardened for the realities of the world. On that February night, he arrived with legal papers and firm intentions. The state had found placements for Emma and Samuel Morrison. Emma would go to the Lowell textile mills where young girls worked long hours to support themselves. Samuel would be sent to a farm in western Massachusetts where he would learn the value of hard labor. They would leave in the morning separately on different wagons heading in opposite directions. These children have been coddled long enough, Whitmore had said, stamping snow off his boots in the front hall. They cling to each other like ivy to a wall. It's not natural, this dependence. They need to learn to stand alone. Sister Mary Catherine had pleaded with him. She explained how much progress the twins had made, how they were beginning to heal from their terrible loss. She begged him to find placements where they could stay together, or at least visit each other. But Whitmore was unmoved. The law was the law, and the state had decided what was best. That night, after Whitmore had gone to bed in the small guest room, Sister Mary Catherine had walked the halls of the orphanage, her heart heavy with impossible choices. She stopped outside the twins' room and listened to their quiet breathing. Through the crack under the door, she could see the faint outline of their hands reaching toward each other across the space between their beds. Emma whimpered in her sleep, caught in one of the nightmares that still visited her most nights. Immediately, Samuel's fingers found hers, and the whimpering stopped. Even in sleep, they protected each other from the darkness. Sister Mary Catherine had stood in that hallway for hours, wrestling with her conscience. She knew what the morning would bring. She knew that no power on earth would change Thomas Whitmore's mind. She knew that Emma and Samuel would be torn apart, sent to places where no one would understand their silent language or their need for each other's presence. She also knew that she could not let it happen. The decision came to her slowly, like dawn breaking over frozen fields. It was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual understanding that some bonds were too sacred to be broken by law or logic. Emma and Samuel had lost their parents, their home, everything they had known. They could not lose each other too. At 3 a.m, Sister Mary Catherine had made her choice. She moved through the orphanage like a woman in prayer, gathering what the twins would need for their journey. Warm clothes, bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, the few small possessions they had brought with them from their burnt home. She woke them gently, pressing her finger to her lips to signal silence. Emma's eyes had filled with questions, but she asked none. Samuel had taken her hand immediately, understanding without words that they were leaving. Sister Mary Catherine had dressed them quickly, her hands shaking as she buttoned their coats and pulled on their boots. "Where are we going?" Emma had whispered, the first word she had spoken in 3 months. "Somewhere safe," Sister Mary Catherine had answered, though she did not know if such a place existed in the February wilderness. "Somewhere you can stay together." They had slipped out through the kitchen door while the orphanage slept. The storm was worsening, wind howling through the bare trees like the voices of the lost. Snow fell thick and fast, erasing their footprints almost as quickly as they made them. Sister Mary Catherine had led them toward the woods behind St. Aurelia, believing that love would guide their steps and God would provide shelter. She had believed that saving them from separation was worth any risk, any consequence. She had believed that good intentions could overcome winter's merciless hunger for innocent souls. The storm that night had been worse than anyone could have imagined. Sister Mary Catherine walked through her memories like a woman walking through deep snow, each step heavier than the last. In the chapel, 30 years later, she could still feel the bite of that February wind, still hear the sound of her own desperate breathing as she led Emma and Samuel into the wilderness behind St. Aurelia. They had walked for what felt like hours through the swirling darkness. The twins held each other's hands while Sister Mary Catherine gripped Emma's free hand, forming a human chain against the wind that tried to tear them apart. Snow fell so thick she could barely see 3 feet ahead. The cold cut through their coats like knives, and with each step, she began to understand the terrible mistake she was making. But she could not turn back. Behind them lay Thomas Whitmore and his papers, the mourning that would separate Emma and Samuel forever. Ahead lay only the unknown, but at least it was an unknown they would face together. Samuel had been the first to stumble. His small legs could not match the pace Sister Mary Catherine set in her desperate flight from the orphanage. He fell face first into a snowdrift, his cry of pain lost in the howling wind. Emma dropped to her knees beside him, pulling him close, her arms wrapped around his shivering body. "We have to keep moving," Sister Mary Catherine had shouted over the storm. But even as she said it, she realized they had no destination. She had led them into the woods with no plan except escape, no shelter except the hope that somewhere in the frozen wilderness they would find sanctuary. They had taken refuge under a large pine tree whose thick branches offered some protection from the falling snow. Sister Mary Catherine shared what food she had brought, breaking the bread into small pieces that the children ate with numb fingers. She wrapped them in her own cloak, pulling them close to her body for warmth, feeling how small they were, how fragile against the winter's fury. Emma had looked up at her with eyes that held too much understanding for an 8-year-old girl. "Are we going to die?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sister Mary Catherine had not known how to answer. The truth was that they might all freeze before morning if they stayed in the woods. But going back meant losing each other, meant watching these children torn apart by a system that saw only their usefulness, not their souls. "We are going to stay together," she had said finally. "Whatever happens, we will face it together." They had huddled under that pine tree until dawn, taking turns sleeping while one of them stayed awake to watch for wild animals or to shake the others if they grew too cold. Sister Mary Catherine spent those long hours praying, bargaining with God, promising anything if only he would show them a way to survive. When the gray light of morning finally came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Everything looked different, unfamiliar. The path they had taken through the woods was gone, erased by wind and falling snow. Sister Mary Catherine realized they were lost, with no idea which direction would lead them back to safety. Samuel was shivering uncontrollably now, his lips blue with cold. Emma had grown quiet, her eyes glazed with the kind of exhaustion that came from fighting too hard against impossible odds. Sister Mary Catherine knew they had to find shelter soon or watch these children die from exposure. She had carried them, one at a time, through the deep snow, looking for any sign of human habitation, a cabin, a barn, even an abandoned shed where they could wait out the cold. But the wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, white and silent and deadly. It was Emma who saw the smoke first, a thin gray line rising above the trees about a mile away. Sister Mary Catherine had felt hope bloom in her chest like a flower in spring. Someone lived out here in the woods, someone with a fire and walls, and the mercy to help 3 lost souls. They had struggled through the snow toward that distant smoke, falling and rising and falling again, their progress measured in yards instead of miles. The twins helped each other, Samuel supporting Emma when she stumbled, Emma encouraging Samuel when he wanted to give up. Their love for each other was the only thing stronger than the cold. But when they finally reached the source of the smoke, Sister Mary Catherine's hope turned to ash in her throat. It was not a house or a cabin. It was the remains of an old trapper's shelter that had caught fire and burned to the ground, leaving only smoldering timbers and the bitter smell of destruction. They had stood in the ruins of their last hope, 3 figures against the white expanse of winter, and Sister Mary Catherine had finally understood what her choice had cost. In trying to save the twins from separation, she had led them to something far worse. She had brought them to a place where they would die together, which had seemed like mercy, but now felt like the cruelest punishment of all. The twins had lain down in each other's arms beside the smoking remains of the shelter. Emma had whispered something to Samuel that Sister Mary Catherine could not hear, some final secret shared between souls who had never learned to exist apart. Samuel had nodded and kissed his sister's forehead, and they had closed their eyes together as the cold claimed them. Sister Mary Catherine had found them that way when she woke from her own exhausted sleep. Emma and Samuel Morrison, their small hands intertwined, their faces peaceful in the way that only comes with the end of all struggle. They had died as they had lived since their parents' death, holding each other against a world that wanted to tear them apart. She had carried their bodies back to St. Aurelia 3 days later, arriving to find Thomas Whitmore in a rage over the missing children. She had told him they had wandered off in the storm and gotten lost, that she had found them too late to save them. The inspector had blamed her carelessness, threatened to have her removed from her position, but in the end, he had simply left, disgusted by what he saw as another example of her weakness. Only Sister Mary Catherine knew the truth. Only she understood that Emma and Samuel had not wandered into the storm by accident. She had led them there, driven by love and desperation and the terrible belief that good intentions could overcome the laws of nature. She had buried them under the old oak tree behind the orphanage in a grave she dug with her own hands. She had marked the spot with a simple wooden cross and promised their small souls that she would carry their secret forever. Now, 30 years later, the letter from Boston trembled in her weathered hands, and she understood that some promises were meant to be broken. The rain had stopped by the time Sister Mary Catherine walked to the old oak tree behind St. Aurelia. Her steps were slow and measured, each one carrying the weight of 30 years. In her apron pocket, the letter from Boston rustled with every movement, its words burned into her memory like brands on her soul. The oak tree stood exactly where it had always stood, its massive trunk scarred by decades of weather, but still strong, still reaching toward heaven with branches that had sheltered countless secrets. Sister Mary Catherine had planted it herself in the spring of 1835, a year after she buried Emma and Samuel beneath its roots. She had chosen an oak because oaks lived longer than human memory, longer than guilt, longer than the kind of pain that felt like it would never end. Now, at 68, she knelt beside the tree with a small shovel she had taken from the orphanage's garden shed. The ground was soft from the autumn rain, easier to dig than it had been 30 years ago when the earth was still frozen from that terrible winter. Her hands shook as she broke the surface, not from age, but from the knowledge of what lay beneath. The letter in her pocket contained more than just news of Thomas Whitmore's death. It contained a confession that changed everything Sister Mary Catherine thought she knew about that February night in 1834. The lawyer's careful handwriting had revealed a truth that made her own secret feel like a feather compared to the stone she had carried for 3 decades. Thomas Whitmore had not died in peace. In his final months, consumed by guilt and the fear of facing judgment, he had told his lawyer everything. He had confessed that his decision to separate Emma and Samuel Morrison had not been based on state policy or what was best for the children. It had been based on something far more shameful. The lawyer's letter explained it all in cold, precise language. Thomas Whitmore had received money from the Lowell textile mills for every child he sent them. Young girls were valuable workers, their small fingers perfect for threading machines, their desperation making them compliant. The more children he delivered, the larger his commission grew. Emma Morrison had been worth $50 to him. Samuel, being a boy destined for farm work, was worth nothing except the satisfaction of another successful placement. Whitmore had cared nothing for their bond as twins, nothing for their grief or healing. He had seen only profit in their separation, money that would line his own pockets while two children suffered for the rest of their lives. But Sister Mary Catherine's choice that night had cost him his payment. When Emma and Samuel disappeared into the storm, Whitmore lost not only his commission but his reputation with the mills. They questioned his ability to control the children in his care, began sending their business to other county inspectors. His income dried up, forcing him into a lesser position with the state, a punishment he had endured for the rest of his life. The irony was sharp as winter wind. Sister Mary Catherine had spent 30 years believing she was a murderer, that her desperate act of love had killed two innocent children. But the truth was more complex, more painful in some ways than the lie she had told herself. Emma and Samuel had died because of her choice, yes, but they would have suffered far worse if they had lived to fulfill Thomas Whitmore's plans. The textile mills were killing grounds for children. Young girls worked 16-hour days in conditions that destroyed their lungs and their spirits. Most died before their 20th birthday from illness, exhaustion, or accidents with the massive machines. Those who survived were broken in body and soul, their childhood sacrificed to the greed of men who saw them as nothing more than replaceable parts. Sister Mary Catherine's shovel struck something solid in the earth. She brushed away the dirt with her hands and found what she had buried so long ago. Not bodies. Those had long since returned to dust, but the small wooden box she had made to hold their few possessions. Emma's torn dress, the one she had worn the night of the fire that killed their parents. Samuel's wooden top, carved by his father's hands. A lock of hair from each child, dark brown like rich earth. She lifted the box with reverence, cradling it against her chest like a mother holding her child. These were all that remained of Emma and Samuel Morrison in the physical world. Everything else lived only in her memory and her guilt, in the prayers she had whispered every morning for 30 years. The letter for Boston had offered her a choice that felt impossible. The lawyer wanted information about the twins' fate so he could settle Whitmore's estate. The inspector had left instructions that if the children were found alive, his fortune should go to them. If they were dead, the money should be donated to orphanages in their memory. Sister Mary Catherine could lie. She could claim the twins had been found, that they had grown up and lived full lives somewhere far from Massachusetts. She could collect the money and use it to help other orphaned children, turning Whitmore's guilt into something good. No one would ever know the difference. Or she could tell the truth. She could reveal that Emma and Samuel Morrison had died in 1834, that their bodies lay beneath an oak tree behind an abandoned orphanage. She could confess her role in their death and face whatever consequences came with that honesty. But as she sat in the soft earth beside their grave, holding the wooden box that contained their memory, Sister Mary Catherine began to understand something she had missed for 30 years. The choice she had made that February night was not between life and death. It was between love and profit, between keeping two souls together and allowing them to be torn apart for money. Emma and Samuel had died in each other's arms, whispering secrets and sharing warmth until the very end. They had faced their final moments the way they had faced every moment since their parents' death, together, protecting each other from the darkness. In the cruelest winter imaginable, they had found a kind of peace that no textile mill, no forced separation, no county inspector's greed could have given them. Sister Mary Catherine opened the wooden box and looked at their few treasures. Emma's dress still smelled faintly of smoke from the fire that had made them orphans. Samuel's top was smooth from countless hours of play. The locks of hair were soft as silk, as dark as the earth that had received them. She thought of all the children who had passed through the doors of St. Aurelia over the years. Some had found loving families, others had grown up and made families of their own. A few had died young, victims of disease or accident or the simple cruelty of a world that was often unkind to those who had no one to protect them. But all of them had been loved while they were in her care. All of them had known, even briefly, what it felt like to be wanted. That was the truth Thomas Whitmore had never understood. Children were not commodities to be bought and sold, not workers to be used until they broke. They were souls with their own light, their own capacity for love and joy and sorrow. Emma and Samuel had taught her that, even in their death. The spring rain began to fall again, gentle drops that washed the dirt from her hands and watered the ground where two children rested. Sister Mary Catherine made her decision not with her mind, but with her heart, the same way she had decided 30 years ago to lead them into the storm. She would tell the truth, all of it, because the truth was the only gift she had left to give them.